Okay, great. I'm going to start us off. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Caitlin Cornadoloff. I'm with USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service. Today, we are having a webinar called the Soft Launch for our Food Loss and Waste Value Chain Selection Guide, which is part of a study that's being led by Agribusiness Associates called International Food Loss and Waste Hotspots and Business Models Study. So we're really happy to have you here. The webinar today follows on a previous webinar we had on July 16th called Integrating Food Loss and Waste Lenses into Value Chain Selection. And we are planning to have one more. It's a series of 3 that's associated with this study. Our goals for today are to share the guide with you and to assess applicability to USAID and USDA international programs specifically, and looking at how we're making investment decisions and integrating food loss and waste into our work. Next slide. Okay, so for the ground rules today, we just ask that everyone stay muted except for during the Q&A session. You can feel free then to raise your hand and moderator will call on you and you can unmute. If you can and are interested in leaving the video on, that's great for us. It's easier to engage. And then for questions or comments, you can feel free to put those in the chat box, or you can raise your hand under the participants next to your name, or you can give a thumbs up or a clap. Anything if you want to interact, feel free to use any of those. If you can't see the screen or hear us at any time, please do let us know in the chat. We'll have a couple people watching that. And I want everyone to know we are recording today's session, so it will be available to you or to colleagues later on. All right, next slide. Going over the agenda today, we're going to be together for an hour, and we're going to take the first 45 minutes to present to you the content. We'll talk a little bit about the collaboration between USDA and USAID, and then we have Dr. Jean Busby, who will be presenting on food loss and waste and USDA resources. We're excited to have her with us. And then Rashmi Eka will be presenting on the Food Loss and Waste Value Chain Selection Guide that ABA has been working on, and we'll end with some time for Q&A. All right, next slide. So here, I just want to give you guys some background on how USDA and USAID are working together. So we've had a long-term partnership working on agriculture and climate change issues, specifically between USAID's Office of Global Climate Change, the Sustainable Landscapes team, and Noel Gerwick is representing that team today. And between USDA FAS's Global Programs, Resilient Agriculture team. And USDA is really interested in working on this right now because we have an agriculture innovation agenda, which is domestic, but it highlights that food loss and waste is a priority area for our work, and we're interested in sharing that internationally. Some of the questions this year in targeting food loss and waste research, we've been asking ourselves, how can we incorporate this into our programs and our teams specifically, but then more broadly, what capacities are needed to develop and scale innovations globally, and what's needed to support greater investment in food loss and waste. So we'll be looking at how to use food loss and waste to develop new agricultural products, and then the greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with those and the business opportunities. And with that, I'll hand it over to Noel Gerwick to just talk a couple minutes about USAID's priorities. Thanks.
Thanks, Caitlin. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, no? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I'm a senior technical advisor on the Sustainable Landscapes team in the Office of Global Climate Change at USAID. We've had a very productive and enjoyable collaboration with Caitlin and her colleagues at USDA over the last several years. We're really glad to be continuing that, working with Agribusiness Associates. The overarching objective, for those who aren't familiar, of our Sustainable Landscapes program is to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases from the land, including increasing the storage of carbon in the land. And a lot of our work focuses on avoiding deforestation and on managing and restoring forests. We work on agriculture as well, and we do it in several different ways. Really glad to see colleagues from USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security with us today as well. One of the reasons we work on agriculture is that it's an important driver of deforestation globally, so we work to reduce that pressure. But we've also worked on agriculture as a direct source of emissions and how to reduce that. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is if we look back over 20 years or so, there was initially a lot of work on how specific practices on a field could reduce greenhouse gas emissions from that field. And then over the last 10 years or so, we've seen more attention to how demand for agricultural products drives emissions. And one aspect of that is food loss and waste. So the more food that's lost and wasted, the more you have to produce, the greater the pressures on land use change, the more resources you need to use to produce food. The more food that's wasted, at least in industrialized contexts, the more that ends up in landfills, the more methane that's produced from that. So this whole demand side of agriculture has really caught a lot of institutions' attention over the last 10 years. And we felt that we should be contributing to that also and thinking about how working on that demand side of things might be useful for USAID's programs as well. And this is one of our efforts to contribute in that vein. Rashmi.
I'm actually going to take back over. Thanks so much, Noel, for giving us that context. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. I'm really excited that Dr. Jean Busby is able to join us. She's worked either directly or indirectly for USDA's Economic Research Service for over 25 years, and she's provided leadership on food security, food safety, food consumption, and food loss research, and has over 150 publications. Jean was recently on a 6-month detail at the EPA, and is currently in USDA's Food Loss and Waste Liaison on detail with the Office of the Chief Economist, and we're really excited to have her. So thanks so much, Jean. We look forward to hearing information about USDA's resources and research. Thanks.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really my pleasure to share with you information on food loss and waste in a development context. Next slide. Can you forward the slide, please?
I'm trying, Jean.
All right.
So my computer's.
Well, okay, no worries. So basically what I'd like to do is start out with a global overview of the amount of food loss and waste, and then talk a little bit about the causes as well as the benefits of reducing food loss and waste. I'll share with you quickly 2 concepts that I've learned from my measurement studies. I'm going to also share with you a little bit about the U.S. government response to reduce food loss and waste with a focus on USDA resources that could help in a development context. And then I'll conclude with ways to reduce food loss and waste in developing countries. Next slide. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, roughly 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted globally, and that's about 1.3 billion tons per year. I've been working in this space since about 2001, and I've really seen a growing awareness and attention to food loss and waste in the literature, and both domestically and globally, and that's particularly true in this past decade. Target 12.3 of the Sustainable Development Goals calls for cutting global food waste at the retail and consumer levels in half by 2030, as well as cutting back on food losses along the production and supply chains earlier in the farm to fork chain, that is. I want to note that Goal 12 is ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. The point is that food loss and waste really is a systems issue. And I also want to mention that the U.S. also has the national goal to cut food waste by 50% by 2030. Next slide. Now don't be scared of this slide. We're really going to only focus on the upper left corner. I have the other details there just in case you want to refer back to it at your leisure. But I wanted to say in the United States, the common thinking is that food loss and waste is estimated around 30 to 40% of the food supply. And I want to make 2 points here. First of all, there are 2 main federal sources of estimates on food loss and waste. We have the USDA's Economic Research Service, which estimates retail and consumer level food loss. And we have the Environmental Protection Agency that measures food waste as it's ready to be managed in municipal solid waste facilities. But most countries don't have data for these methods, so I don't want to focus a lot of time here on that right now. The second point is that food loss and waste data and estimation methods are continuing to develop both in the US and globally. It's definitely an evolving science. And also I wanted to say that, for measurement, reaching out to USDA, Economic Research Service, and EPA, we could be good partners to explore measurement issues, techniques, and lessons learned. Next slide. So as far as the causes of food loss and waste, they can occur for many reasons, with some types occurring at every point of the farm to fork chain, such as spoilage and a lack of knowledge about what causes food loss and waste and how to prevent it. And these causes can also vary by commodity, country, product, region, and so forth. At the farm to retail stages, we see a lack of labor to harvest crops, lack of or inadequate cold chain and other storage, and lack of infrastructure to connect smallholders to markets, among other reasons. At the retail level, lack of cold chain can be big as well, and equipment can malfunction. In developed countries, overordering and culling of blemished produce is a major driver. Now, I wanted to share a quick aside. In the literature, you commonly see that the theory that in developing countries that most of the food loss and waste happens closer to the farm, and in developed countries it's closer to the consumer, but I'm not aware of any data that really proves it, but it's all out there in the literature. As far as consumers can buy or cook more than they need and throw out the extras. Lack of cold storage could be a problem as well. And by the time produce and other perishable foods gets to the consumers, there may be little shelf life left. Next slide. Reducing food loss and waste can generate many or several benefits to society. It can help with reduced food insecurity. Reducing food waste can save or make money. And also the resources used to make the uneaten food, such as fresh water, land, labor, and energy, as well as other inputs like farm chemicals, they could all be conserved for more productive uses, such as producing food that's actually eaten. And greenhouse gases could be reduced to help mitigate climate change. For example, if you bring in less new land and use heavy equipment or machinery to produce food and transport it, that can cut down the greenhouse gases, as well as if you put less in landfills where food rots and creates methane gas, that could also be reduced. Now, composting is really a management pathway, as is anaerobic digestion or energy generation or rendering or other kinds of management pathways, but I wanted to mention it here because by composting food waste, it really can lead to increased soil carbon storage and potentially more productive soils. Next slide. I have two concepts I just want to quickly share with you. They're both from the United States, but they probably apply to other countries as well. So the top three food groups in terms of food loss and waste vary depending on what you're actually measuring. Are you measuring the amount, the value, or calories? In the United States, in terms of the quantities or amounts, dairy products, vegetables, and grain products were the top three in terms of food loss and waste. And then when you count in terms of dollars, meat, poultry, and fish was the number one food group, and that's because of the high cost per pound. Calories, the top three groups were added fats and oils, added sugar and sweeteners, and grain products because of the high caloric content. Next slide. Another shared concept is within a food group, the top commodities in terms of the rate of loss for a particular commodity may be different than the commodities with the highest amounts of food loss and waste by weight. This example's in the US for vegetables in supermarkets, fresh vegetables. In the middle, you can see the green spikes for mustard greens and turnip greens with the axis on the right. They're around 60% loss rate or shrinkage in supermarkets. But if you look at the far left, potatoes and tomatoes and romaine and leaf lettuce, they have the most amount of food loss in terms of fresh vegetables in supermarkets. And that's because the high volume, these are things that are important to consumption by US consumers. Next slide. I'm not going to go into much of this. I just want to point out that many of the U.S. federal activities to reduce food loss and waste have a domestic focus. I'm going to quickly just mention the first one, and feel free to look back at this slide and click all the links at your leisure and another date. I wanted to mention that the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration have all signed a joint formal agreement, this Winning on Reducing Food Waste initiative, to align these federal efforts among these agencies to reduce food loss and waste. And there's 6 priority areas. Next slide. However, there are USDA resources, tools, and approaches for addressing food loss and waste that could apply to a development context. Now, this is just an example, a few examples, and I'm sure there are more. And the first one is really innovations. USDA's Agricultural Research Service conducts research on new technologies and develops new products from food waste materials and food processing facilities. The second sub-bullet is an example I'll quickly share with you, where through their funding, there was an inexpensive, small-scale peanut processing equipment that was developed that really helped Haiti out by cutting post-harvest losses of locally grown peanuts by about 75%, as well as speeding local production of peanut butter-based foods, which is important for preventing malnutrition there. There are also things that may not be appropriate for all countries, but I just want to mention this as an example of something that where lessons learned from one country can be used to leapfrog ahead. And in this case, you know, there's been a lot of concern in the United States about consumer confusion about date labels, best by, use by, sell by, all that. And so a lot of extra food is thrown out just to be, for consumers to feel safe. But the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service has a fact sheet on this food product dating, and they finally, under their analysis, they encourage the best if used by phrase to convey quality. And I'm bringing this up because countries without a current national food labeling could leapfrog to that label. There's also, USDA has guidance available on food storage by consumers. It's available online and on mobile devices. It's called the Food Keeper app. It's got thousands of foods in there. So it tells you how long you can keep fresh eggs, for example. There are also select data sources that may be of use in a development context. For example, ARS, this National Nutrient Database for Standard Reference, is a major source of food composition data and breaks down if you have a nutrient focus and a need for understanding the nutrient composition of certain foods. This is a great resource, and also the water content. And next slide. I want to quickly end on some ways to reduce food loss and waste in developing countries. First of all, more widespread education from farm to fork on the causes of food loss and waste. And so people know if they, what they can do to reduce it. Better infrastructure to connect smallholders to markets is important, as well as more effective value chains that provide sufficient financial incentives at the producer level, and also greater opportunities to adopt collective marketing and better technologies supported by access to microcredit. Also, public and private sectors can share the investment costs and risks in market-oriented interventions. I just want to mention, as a quick aside, that some investments, such as cold chain infrastructure, can meet multiple objectives, such as contributing to development, facilitating trade, reducing food loss and waste, and keeping food edible and available for ultimate consumption by people. And lastly, improving data and estimates of food loss and waste can help with the premise that what gets measured gets managed. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. I also have another slide with some additional resources you might want to look at your leisure. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jean. I really appreciate that presentation, and it's really helpful to have you highlight the different resources USDA has, both in terms of our services like ARS and ERS, but then also some of these guides, and just emphasizing the different spaces within the value chain where we can address food loss and waste. So thank you so much for sharing that. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker, Rashmi Eka, who is an agriculture development and food loss expert at Agribusiness Associates. Most recently, she developed and managed 2 USAID Feed the Future Horticulture Innovation Lab projects to reduce post-harvest loss in horticulture in Rwanda and Burkina Faso. And she's leading research on food loss assessments in multiple countries and developing strategies to reduce food loss. So Rashmi, with that, I will turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Caitlin. Just to confirm, everyone can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
We're good. Yep.
Okay, I'll get started. So good morning, everyone. I'm looking forward to sharing our food loss and waste value chain selection guide with you. First off, I want to make sure that everyone can download the beta version of the guide. Here are the links. I've also typed it into the chat button. So feel free to take a minute and download that either now or after the webinar. This is the beta version, and we will be finalizing the guide in the next few weeks, and we'll share the final version as well. But for now, we thought that this might be helpful. So Jean gave us a really good overview of food loss and waste, which is a global and complex problem. I just want to emphasize that most of the work that is done in agriculture today is linked to increasing production, while attention to saving the food that we do so painstakingly grow has been quite slow and limited. So in the last decade, there has been increasing recognition of the food loss and waste problem, and now the case has been strongly made that we can greatly reduce food insecurity as well as a negative impact on agriculture on the environment by working on food loss and waste. This is really a human health and planetary health issue, and here I have some compelling statistics from the FAO 2013 and 2019 studies which shed light on where and which foods are being lost and their impacts on carbon, blue water, and land footprints. So now let's just dive into the food loss and waste value chain selection guide and the process. So we'll not walk through the whole guide, but just give you an overview of how it's structured and how you can best use it. On this slide, we have here the main steps that are normally used for any value chain selection process. So we start with framing the food loss and waste objective. If food loss and waste is not part of your project's objectives, then it will not flow down into the value chain selection and then the value chain development work. So this is really key that the food loss and waste goals are clearly known for your project. Next, we do shortlisting of promising value chains, then choosing the prioritization criteria, then doing the qualitative and quantitative data collection for the prioritization criteria. And then finally, usually the findings are presented at a stakeholder workshop for validation and final selection of the value chain. So our guide fits very well into this standard approach of doing value chain selection and provides information that users will need to take the food loss and waste criteria and make it part of their selection methodology. We'll skip ahead in the process to choosing the prioritization criteria, which is related to food loss and waste. So for those of you who have done a value chain selection process in the past, this will look very familiar. This is USAID's value chain selection process, and it can be found on market links. The criteria that they have here really covers the big meta concepts that are really integral to value chain development principles. Many development organizations will have their own selection methodology, which will largely be based on these criteria here, as well as their organization's mandates. The main criteria are competitiveness potential. I'm going to move my mouse around so you know where I am. So competitiveness potential, Then there is impact potential, which normally focuses on alleviating poverty, cross-cutting issues, including youth, gender, nutrition, industry leadership, where we see if there are organizations that can play a leadership role and can serve as the lead firm, resilience, and implementation feasibility. So this is how someone would normally go about selecting a value chain. And doing this process is really important because the foundation of value chain selection really rests on market dynamics and market demand. But now we recognize the need to integrate food loss and waste into our work, starting with selection. So we look at where food loss and waste issues would come into, come within this framework. I think they would be part of cross-cutting issues here as well as resilience. I want to share two examples of two different approaches that we have used in the past to do value chain selection. This is really just to jog your mind about how things have been done in the past and how food loss and waste can be integrated in. So here's an example from some work I did in Ethiopia for Catholic Relief Services with Connexus. We did a value chain selection exercise for 14 counties, and we looked at several crops and ended up at 8. And it was quite an in-depth exercise where we, had farmer focus groups. We talked to retailers, to wholesalers, and we looked at 20 indicators in total. And the indicators are listed right over here. There were 10 impact indicators and 10 feasibility indicators, and a lot of these were, are from that USAID value chain selection slide that I just showed. And so we rated several crops on these 20 indicators and then selected our final 8. Another example is from ABA's work in Rwanda for the Horticulture Innovation Lab, where we wanted to reduce post-harvest loss in horticulture, for which we wanted to choose a few focus crops, which would extend our work throughout the entire horticulture sector. So we chose a portfolio approach to value chain selection, where we selected tomato, a crop of regional importance, which has a lot of scope for food loss and waste work, as it's highly perishable as well as has high value and nutrition. For domestic market, we chose orange flesh sweet potato, as it has a food security and nutrition focus with spillover effects on other tubers. Green banana was chosen as the staple crop, and green chili was chosen as it's a high value export crop with potential to develop local processing. So you see, we tried to have 4 signature crops from 4 very different parts of the horticulture sector, so that our hypothesis was that if we work on these 4, the food loss tools, technology solutions, and systemic change will flow to the rest of the horticulture sector, which we did see happen. So this here now are the food loss and waste criteria that we've identified for value chain selection that are really important. So we have 12. And this is where the heart of the guide really is, walking you through these 12 criteria. So the first is, what is the value chain's potential to reduce food loss? What is the potential to reduce food waste? What are the economic outcomes of food loss and waste in the value chain? How is the value chain's food loss and waste related to food security and nutrition outcomes? How does the value chain's food loss and waste relate to climate vulnerability, to carbon footprint, to water footprint, to land footprint? What is the relationship to biodiversity and wildlife, gender equality, youth? And finally, what is the investment opportunity for food loss and waste technologies and solutions in this value chain? So the guide walks you through each of these 12 criteria and how to do quick qualitative and quantitative analysis to help select your focus crops. This is how the guide is laid out, every criteria has one page. On the left, you have up to 5 guiding questions to help stimulate discussion on the crops. These discussion questions, they can be done with local partners, team members, and using expert knowledge. So, for example, for the food loss criteria, the questions are: how perishable is the food? Where in the chain does the loss occur? What is the main cause of loss? And which actors drive the loss? And then on the right side of the page, there is a quantitative indicator for food loss and resources to find this data. In many cases, however, for your given country and a given crop, there may be no studies done and this data may not be available. In that situation, one of the guiding questions can be used as an indicator. For example, you can rate perishability by low, medium, high, and then use that as your food loss indicator. So the idea behind the guiding questions is that they will give you enough context and nuance to decide between crops, even when quantitative data is not available, as may often be the case for a given country. Here is similarly the next criteria on food waste. The questions are on the left, the indicators on the right, and this format will continue for all 12 criteria. For those who've clicked on that download button, you will also notice that there's an accompanying checklist document in which all of these 12 criteria, questions, indicators, and sources of data are laid out. So it's kind of handy and easy to use and walk through. So now that you've decided your food loss and waste objectives, you can review these 12 criteria and choose the ones which are most aligned with your objectives. Then you can develop a prioritization matrix like this one. This is a template of how it could be done. And this matrix helps to compare the different value chains. You can choose any number of criteria along the top over here. Here we have chosen 10, but it can be really any number as long as they align with all of the objectives that you have. Then for each criteria, you can choose the indicator here. Again, criteria and indicator selection should be done in alignment with the food loss and waste objectives. Choose indicators for which you can easily find or collect the data. And then the different indicators can have different weights here based on the project team's consensus and project objectives. So here I've just put 10% for each indicator, but for your project, maybe food loss and economic value loss and carbon footprint might be the 3 most important things. So you can have weight them higher. Again, I want to emphasize that the criteria presented here is specific to food loss and waste. They're by no means the only criteria that should be considered. If your organization already has a value chain selection methodology with commonly used indicators or criteria like the USAID ones I shared a few slides back, then we recommend that either you choose the food loss and waste criteria from here and include it in your existing methodology. That way it will reduce research burden and facilitate faster decision making. When selecting food loss and waste criteria, avoid overlap with existing criteria. This can be done if your existing methodology is flexible and where it's easy to add different criteria. The other option is you can do this food loss and waste value chain selection exercise as part of your overall value chain selection exercise. So it can be like an activity or a module within the overall value chain selection. So on a closing note, this guide is really provided as guidance on food loss and waste criteria, which can be used for value chain selection. It is not a protocol or a methodology, but is meant to be used as part of your organization's overall methodology. Lastly, comparing value chains is not a mathematical exercise. Many times quantitative data will not be available. So in that case, we hope that the qualitative discussion questions will lead project designers to, ask the right questions and have the right discussion that will help them compare the various crops and select the ones for food loss and waste interventions. As a first step, when the project does start, baseline food loss and waste measurements should be taken so then they can be tracked, as one of the key M&E for the project. So with that, thank you. And I'll hand it over to Caitlin.
Thanks so much, Rashmi, for that introduction to the guide. I think it's great that it's meant to be embedded within existing processes that either USAID or other institutions have, and that it has the option for quantitative and qualitative methods. As Jean said, countries have different levels of data, and so it's important that we have flexibility there. So thanks so much for outlining that. So we have some time to go into Q&A, and I'm going to turn that over to Noel to make a few comments and then open that up.
And I'm going to stop screen here.
Okay.
So we can all look at each other.
Sounds good. Yeah, feel free to put your videos on if you want. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jean and Rashmi. One of the points that Rashmi made to us as we were talking through this and working with agribusiness associates over the last couple of months was that they appreciated the opportunity to take a step back and develop some of this guidance because they have been in so many situations where a value chain is chosen for a random reason or without incorporating the kind of considerations that this guide helps to articulate. I would be curious, I think we'd be curious to hear from, we've got about 50 people on this call, which is terrific, from others about what you think about this guide. Have you been involved in value chain selections yourself where you could have seen this kind of tool being useful? Have you incorporated these kinds of considerations broadly in your value chain selections in the past? How has it worked out? Any reflections you have, we'd love to hear, and it might be valuable to share with each other as well.
And if you have a comment, you can either type it in the chat, we'll be watching that, or feel free to raise your hand. We'll be monitoring that as well. Yeah, Danielle. Okay.
There we go. I think the guideline is pretty accurate. It's very good to go through all the steps to make sure that whatever value chain you're working in has the opportunity. One of the things I wanted to add is, particularly when you're looking at export products, it's very important to also make sure that whatever you're working on export has market access to the country you're trying to export with. When I was in working with MCC in El Salvador, they were going to start working on a value chain that was 10 years away from having market access to the US, and so all that work was going to be wasted. It's very important to make sure, especially with fresh produce, that under IPPC rules, every country that accepts a new fresh product has to have a market access protocol already in place. So it's something that, even though it doesn't show on your thing, when you're looking at export products, make sure you consider it.
That's a very good point, I think. I appreciate it.
Lourdes, excuse me, Lourdes, you put something in the chat. Do you want to say a few words about that, expand on it a bit?
I was just trying to get my computer is also slow. No, this is a great presentation. Thank you. And Jen, I've been following you for a long time, since my years at Michigan State working with ERS. I work with Dr. Suzanne Thornsbury. I think you work with her too on food safety issues and SBS standards, and also with Daniel and some other colleagues. So I just wanted to say, this is great. I mean, I don't think, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, that at RFS we've been looking at food waste and food loss. And Rashmi, you know that we've been working on the horticulture and post-harvest stuff, but not with the lens of thinking of food waste and food loss. And to me, that's very important because it also, like you guys highlighted, has so much of an economic impact and can help some of the people that we are working with. We are trying to do more on the food safety side. We are trying to look at, standards and, but it's not yet like very specific to food waste and food loss. But, I don't know if Jean or Rashmi, you could say something more about like the food safety component too, because it is a side of it too.
Well, food safety, of course, is a big consideration, and sometimes it's not apparent if a food is safe or not. And so that's why, consumer labeling was an issue that, sometimes when in doubt, they throw it out. But yes, we certainly don't want to compromise anybody's health with the food safety issues as well. And I don't know if you have a more specific question, but it's definitely very important.
It was directly, like it was related to that. Like we tell people you shouldn't be eating these things. We shouldn't, like when, there is a very complicated part of when do we throw away food and when it's safe to consume. So yeah, I was referring to something like that. Like, I don't know if you guys have, also
in the United States, we do have date labeling on many products, not all, of course, and not for fresh produce, for example. And as I mentioned, that Food Keeper app is a really good resource to check, when you have concerns. It also has a lot of information on how to store foods properly to maximize the shelf life and usability. So there are a lot of tools out there as well, but you never know. Food safety can happen, or issues can arise from so many different issues. There could be a refrigeration problem earlier in the chain that caused a problem that may not be visible. There's a lot of different issues. But.
Lourdes, go ahead, Noel.
A couple of people had comments in the chat, Biniam and Pace. I'm thinking maybe let's go in order of the chat, use that as a way to ask questions. Even if you don't want to type your question all in the chat, just type something, I've got a question, so we'll know to go in order. So maybe we'll go Biniam, Pace, and then Anna. And Daniel, do you want to chime in again as well? Okay. Biniam, did you want to chime in?
Oh, I thought what I typed was enough, but I just was wondering, how you can use the resources for energy also. Like, for example, all those perishable foods, you can do cold chain and everything, but it might be sometimes worthwhile to combine it with the biogas from livestock and everything. So it can be a resource for energy. And also hopefully it might reduce the greenhouse gas emissions if possible, but I don't know the subject area much. I'm just trying to expand the possibilities if there are any, just for my knowledge. Thank you.
Yes, you're totally right. That is a management pathway. When you can't prevent food loss and waste, it happens, and you can't get edible, wholesome food to feed people or animals and so forth. You want to go to the next best use that has economic value. That could be energy generation. It could be many different ways. It could be rendering of the uneaten part of the animal carcass, for example, to make useful, valuable products like soap and oils and so forth. All of those are important. The worst thing to do, of course, would to put it in a landfill without energy generation. But there's a whole list of the World Resource, WRI has a list of these 10 management pathways. And if you want, I can share them with the group at a later date, 10 or so pathways.
Thank you so much.
Pace. And
Great.
if you want to introduce yourselves briefly when you ask your question, I think everybody might appreciate that.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Pace Lubinsky. I'm with the Foreign Ag Service Global Programs, same unit as Caitlin in the Ag Econ Development. Just wanted to thank all the organizers and presenters. And my question, maybe this is mostly for Rashmi, but just was wondering, you know, this guide sounds amazing, and I think in part because it really captures the gamut of the issues that food loss and waste touch upon, from I think the way you put it, in part on, you know, human health, planetary health, the overall system. And so I think the kind of main part of my question is, what has been the evidence to date? What has worked in terms of using the guide and actually putting all these great ideas into practice? Would be very interested in learning more about that, and or conversely, in trying to promote the adoption of this guide. In addition to the successes, what have been some of the challenges in terms of implementing these really important ideas and considerations? Thank you.
Thanks, Pace. So yes, this guide is new, but it's based on our experience and the experience of several post-harvest loss experts. And we've been working in the industry doing a lot of post-harvest loss projects, but we've noticed, you know, the part of the reason why this guide came about is as the agricultural sector becomes more aware of food loss and waste as a problem, we need to be more intentional of integrating food loss and waste into our projects from the beginning, which starts with, you know, with program design and value chain selection, versus at the end as an afterthought. So, you know, we wanted to work in maize and dairy mostly because of food security and income, and then we do the project and then we say, oh yeah, by the way, we also worked on, you know, storage, and henceforth we reduce food loss. So really it kind of comes from this wanting to provide practical guidance to program designers. And yes, this guide is has not been field tested so far. So if anybody's starting a new program and would like to partner to do this, we've ran it by ourselves, you know, based on our knowledge. We've kind of tried to use the guide in a few different ways to see you know, how someone would be able to use the matrix, but we'd be very interested in partnering with anyone who'd like to take it for a spin as well.
Rashmi, is that something that ideally, I guess you'd be doing that in the context of an actual decision that people are trying to take, you know, in a month or two. Right. But you might also get volunteers from this group to do a retrospective, to apply that tool retrospectively on a project they've been involved with in the past. I don't know exactly how broad your interest is or how much time it would take, but if you're looking for volunteers, you might want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. You know, sometimes if you have like a 5-year project and in year 2 or 3, you want to add in new crops and would like to, again, go back to the drawing board and do a selection process and be more intentional about food loss and waste, I think that would work as well.
I think this is Gil here. It is a design issue, and I appreciate over the time now all the funding agencies are little okay with changing as you learn. So as compared to many years back, where once a design is formed and then you can't change it. So, and Rashmi, we have a question from Beth. Noel?
Well, Daniel had a question, and Anna Madalinska. So maybe Anna and then Daniel.
Great. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Perfect.
Okay, Great. Thank you for this, organizing this session, and thank you for all the presentations. I think actually chronologically my question falls right in line. I wanted to know a little bit more on exactly that, how to integrate this part into a wider program, because just to introduce myself, I work in Food for Progress in the Foreign Agricultural Service and International Food Assistance Division at USDA. And we do, I mean, basically we do notice of funding opportunities for large scale value chain programs every single year. And when we do those, there, can you hear me? I'm seeing that you're getting closer. Is it, can you still hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, great. And so when we do those larger scale programs, you know, looping in with all of these different working groups, these practitioner groups, you know, food waste is just one of the components with the challenges of our food systems that we're trying to pay attention. In addition to that, we might have soil fertility gain concerns. We might have, you know, carbon, just biomass production, or pressure on deforestation concerns. And so I was kind of wondering how you envision, you know, when you have a program that's a little bit more focused and you have, and you're just adding this one component of the food loss, or you have, as you mentioned, food loss specific objectives, it seems a little bit clearer. But how do you envision this as a piece for project designers to be able to add it as a component in this atmosphere where, you know, we're starting to have projects with a level of complexity that not a single implementer can do it on their own. We need to tag on these pieces in a way that works, that works well, that can coordinate without competing in the consortium that is being developed. And so I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. How, if you have specific, for example, service providers that you imagine coming to the forefront that can, you know, consistently add this piece, or yeah, as anything along those lines, please. Thank you.
Anna, thanks for this question. I feel like we are at that crossroads where food loss and waste really needs to be integrated into all of our programming because of how big and, you know, and large and complex of an issue it is, and how much it will affect us going forward. I think we were at this place with gender a few decades back, and we realized that we didn't need, you know, a gender project or a gender expert. Gender needed to be integrated across our programming. So then it became part of the cross-cutting issue. I'm really advocating that food loss and waste also becomes a cross-cutting issue, and all projects, ag projects, you know, become fluent in addressing it. So it's not just a few service providers, but ultimately it becomes part of our agricultural development principles. You know, we, like, everyone really learns and knows how to start working in this direction. I think the scale of the problem warrants that.
Right. Yeah, just to follow up to, if you could, because I totally agree, and I agree we're there with gender, and I agree we're there with food loss as well, but we're also there with soils, and we're also there with pressure on diversification. We're also there in so many different ways, and hopefully at some point, you know, our implementing partners and all practitioners will become well enough versed in all of those different aspects. I'm worried about that transition before we get there. And before we get there, I think that, you know, it will have to be a shared, somehow a shared effort, because, you know, people are just starting to figure out how to operationalize this in each of the aspects as your you know, your tool demonstrates. And so, yeah, so any going forward, as you develop these programs and you have lessons learned, I think that would be really valuable on how to add those pieces together.
Right.
Thanks so much, Anna. I want to go then to Daniel, but then maybe come back to the question, Anna, that you just raised, and ask that question of some of the other people on the call, you know, how they see the opportunities for working across these various angles that you just mentioned. Sorry, my thought was clear when I started responding, then it got a little muddy. So let's go to Daniel, and maybe I'll find my thought again.
I have no comment to make. The comment has already been made throughout the time, so I'm good right now. You can go to the question immediately.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Anybody else have thoughts or recommendations, suggestions, want to volunteer to help out in some way, clarification?
If it's okay, I'd like to call on Beth Mitchum to share her point. Beth has done a lot of work in this space as well.
Thanks, Rashmi. Just real quick, I don't want to take too much time. It's great to see this emphasis, and I think this is a wonderful tool. Other people have said that, but I'd just like to add my kudos to that. It's great to see this, and I agree with you, Rashmi, that we're kind of at this tipping point where hopefully we're going to see a lot more emphasis in this area that has been lacking for a long time. I just wanted to make the point, I think a lot of times when I talk with groups about food loss and waste, I see a lot of tendency to sort of really emphasize the waste reduction part of it, looking for different ways of using fruits and vegetables that aren't going to get consumed by people, like energy production and this sort of thing. I think all that is really important, but I think we need to give our utmost effort to try to reduce losses first, because we're not eating enough of many of these nutritious perishable products. So we want to do everything we can to try to reduce those losses so that people can actually consume these products. And then there's always going to be some waste. So we do need to have ways of utilizing that waste in a productive manner. But I really think the emphasis and a lot more attention needs to go on reducing the losses first, especially in the developing world. But kudos to you, great project, and it's good to see the emphasis.
Maybe I can follow up on that a little bit. Jean mentioned in her introductory remarks, she was talking about labor and the need for sufficient labor in fields to harvest crops when they're ripe before they spoil in the fields. I'm curious, from any of the folks on the phone who are more involved in the design and implementation of food security projects, how much do you see either implementation addressing that issue of labor and matching labor with harvest times, or where you see places where projects are not addressing that and you're seeing food loss in the field as a result? That's something that resonates with the people on the phone who are more directly involved with these projects outside of our agribusiness associates partners here.
Yeah.
Anybody?
And if you want, there's also like a yes, no option in the participant next to your name if you want to do that, which is a quick feedback.
Okay. We are about at an hour. It's 11:58 by my clock. I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank Rashmi and Caitlin and Jean all for their participation in this. This has been, as I said before, we've really enjoyed our collaboration between USAID and USDA on climate change and agriculture, which this is a part. And if anybody has questions, I think Rashmi, you posted maybe in the chat earlier or on one of your slides some links to resources. You're welcome to get in touch with any of us to follow up if you have questions, or if you have ways that you would like to get engaged or involved in some of this work. If you see ways that you would like to help test out this guide or develop complementary materials, we'd love to know about it. Okay. Caitlin, Rashmi, any last words from you guys? Gil?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a big thank you to the ABA team for all their work on this, and also highlight that we are going to do one more webinar with ABA right now, tentatively September 24th around the same time. And ABA is also working on some case studies and business case examples of interventions that can be done to address food loss and waste. So that'll be the next step. So I just wanted to highlight that's coming. Thanks so much. Rashmi, anything from ABA?
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. We'll be following up with an email with this presentation and the links again. And please be in touch. Thank you so much. And let us know if you do end up using this guide, how it goes for you, or if you'd like to collaborate. We're happy to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Very good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks, Rashmi.